The silence of the museum archives had a weight to it, a texture woven from dust motes and the ghosts of forgotten histories. For 3 years, my life had been measured in the quiet click of a security lock and the whisper of my own solitary footsteps across the polished concrete floor. It was a safe life, an ordered one, built on the predictable rhythm of my low-paying curatorial assistant job. I'd come to the city with little more than a degree in art history and a hollow space in my chest where ambition used to be. My apartment was small, my friendships were few, and my world had shrunk to the size of these climate-controlled rooms. It was enough. It had to be. But there was Alastair Finch. He was the museum's primary benefactor, a man whose name was etched in brass on a dozen plaques, a quiet, constant presence in the background of my small world. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with silver at his temples and a stillness that seemed to absorb the noise around him. I saw him at donor events, a tall, steady figure in a well-cut suit, his gaze sweeping over the crowd with a polite detachment that never quite reached his eyes. Those eyes, a deep and thoughtful gray, were always observing, always assessing. I sometimes felt their weight from across a crowded room, a brief, impersonal flicker that still managed to make the air in my lungs feel thin. I kept a program from the previous year's gala tucked into the back of my desk drawer. It was a glossy, expensive thing, and on page 3 was a photograph of him. He was standing beside a newly acquired sculpture, one hand resting lightly on the marble base. The picture didn't capture the quiet intensity I'd noticed in person, but it was a tangible piece of his world, a world of quiet confidence and immense resources that felt as distant as a foreign country. Sometimes, late at night when the loneliness was a physical ache, I would take it out and trace the line of his jaw with my fingertip, a secret, foolish gesture that I never allowed myself to examine too closely. It was a yearning for something I couldn't name, stability, perhaps, or the kind of settled peace he seemed to embody. The catalyst arrived on a Tuesday, disguised as a memo from the director. The museum's deep archives, a labyrinth of forgotten donations and poorly cataloged artifacts stored in the sub-basement, were to be fully inventoried and reorganized. It was a monumental task, one the head archivist, a perpetually flustered woman named Eleanor, had been dreading for years. The memo mentioned a special project fund, established by a private donor, to hire a temporary, full-time assistant for 6 months. The pay was nearly double my current salary. My supervisor called me into her office that afternoon. "The director put your name forward, Leo," she said, peering at me over her glasses. "You're diligent. You're careful. And honestly, you're the only one who knows where half of Eleanor's preliminary files are." She paused. "Mr. Finch is funding the project. He has a personal interest in the collection. His family made some of the earliest donations. He'll be overseeing the work directly." A strange, electric current shot through me. To work with him? Not just to see him across a room, but to be in the same space, sharing a task? It felt impossible, a sudden and dizzying shift in the landscape of my life. The offer was framed as a professional opportunity, clean and ethical, a reward for my quiet competence. It was a choice. I could say no, stay in my safe, predictable routine. But the thought of those 6 months, of that proximity, was a hook I couldn't shake. "I'll do it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. My first day on the project felt like the first day of a new life. The sub-basement archives were a world unto themselves, a vast, cool space that smelled of old paper, cedar, and time itself. Rows of tall metal shelves stretched into the gloom, crowded with wooden crates and canvas-wrapped objects. A single row of bare bulbs cast long, dancing shadows. Eleanor gave me a whirlwind tour, her hands fluttering as she pointed out the sections. "Start with the Lowell collection, in the far corner," she instructed. "Mostly textiles and correspondence. Mr. Finch wants to ensure it's all properly preserved." And then she was gone, leaving me alone in the immense silence. I found the designated corner, a space stacked high with flat, acidic-smelling cardboard boxes. I pulled one from the top, the rough surface scraping against my palms, and set it on the large metal table that served as our workspace. A fine layer of gray dust puffed into the air, coating the front of my dark sweater. I coughed, waving a hand in front of my face, and when I looked up, he was there. Alastair Finch was standing at the end of the aisle, watching me. He hadn't made a sound. He was not in a suit today, but in dark trousers and a soft, gray cashmere sweater that mirrored the color of his eyes. He looked less like a benefactor and more like a scholar, perfectly at home in the quiet gloom. "Leo," he said. His voice was low and warm, with a calm resonance that seemed to settle the dust in the air. It was the first time he had ever spoken my name. "Eleanor said you were getting started." I felt a flush creep up my neck. "Yes, Mr. Finch. Just getting my bearings." My own voice sounded thin, inadequate. He walked toward me, his steps measured and silent on the concrete floor. He didn't stop until he was standing just in front of me, closer than I had ever expected him to be. The air between us felt charged, thick with a sudden, unspoken awareness. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap and something else, something like old books and cold, fresh air. He was taller than I'd realized, and I had to tilt my head back slightly to meet his gaze. His eyes weren't detached now. They were focused entirely on me, perceptive and impossibly calm. He lifted a hand, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to touch my face. My breath caught in my throat, but his fingers, long and careful, went to the collar of my sweater. With a feather-light touch, he brushed away the dust that had settled there. The gesture was brief, practical, and yet it felt overwhelmingly intimate. I could feel the warmth of his hand through the thin fabric of my shirt, a steady heat that seemed to spread through my entire chest. He let his hand fall, but his eyes held mine for a moment longer. "This is a messy job," he said, a faint hint of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. "There are work aprons in the supply closet." Then he gestured to the box on the table. "The Lowell correspondence. My great-grandmother's letters are in there somewhere." He looked at the box, then back at me. A different kind of light was in his eyes now, something softer, something that felt like an invitation. "Stay," he said, the word a soft command. "Let's open the first one together." And just like that, the quiet foundation of my carefully ordered world began to shift, settling into a new and unfamiliar shape. I stayed. Of course I stayed. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was both monastic and deeply compelling. We worked in a shared, companionable silence, punctuated by the rustle of tissue paper, the soft thud of a ledger being placed on the table, and the low murmur of our voices. Alistair, he insisted I call him Alistair on the second day, the name feeling foreign and heavy on my tongue at first, was a methodical and patient partner. He showed me how to handle the brittle, yellowed letters, his large, capable hands demonstrating a surprising delicacy. He taught me the archival numbering system he'd developed, his voice a calm presence beside me as he explained the logic. I spent hours watching him. I learned the way he would push his reading glasses up onto his forehead when he was thinking, the faint lines that crinkled at the corners of his eyes when he deciphered a particularly difficult bit of script. He had a habit of resting his chin in his hand, his long fingers partially obscuring his mouth as he read. It was a pensive, private gesture that made me feel like I was seeing a part of him that was normally hidden from the world. He moved with a quiet economy, a lack of wasted motion that spoke of a deep-seated confidence. Whether he was lifting a heavy crate or carefully turning the fragile page of a photo album, there was a grace to his actions, a sense of purpose. He belonged in this space, among these quiet, sleeping objects. He was a guardian of them, and for these few months, I was his assistant, his partner in this slow, careful work of preservation. The archives became our sanctuary, a world removed from the museum upstairs with its politics and its public. Down here, there was only the work, the shared task, and the growing, unspoken awareness between us. The power dynamic, the vast gulf of wealth and age that separated us, seemed to thin in the dusty air. He was not Mr. Finch, the benefactor. He was Alistair, the man who knew the precise temperature at which old photographs began to degrade, the man who could identify the faint scent of lavender used to perfume a 19th century letter. I began to analyze his every gesture, his every word, searching for meaning. It became a quiet obsession, a secret project running parallel to the one we were paid to do. When he handed me a document, did his fingers linger against mine for a fraction of a second longer than necessary? When he said my name, was there a different inflection in his tone, a warmth that hadn't been there before? One afternoon, I was on a tall, rolling ladder, reaching for a box on the highest shelf. The ladder wobbled slightly as I shifted my weight, and a small gasp escaped my lips. Before I could even think to steady myself, Alistair was there. His hand was warm and firm on the small of my back, a solid, grounding presence. "Easy, Leo," he said, his voice close to my ear. "I've got you." My entire body went still. The warmth of his hand seemed to burn through my shirt, a focused point of heat that radiated through my entire nervous system. He didn't remove his hand immediately. He held it there, steadying me, until I had a firm grip on the box and had started my descent. The touch was protective, practical, and yet it felt like so much more. It was a silent acknowledgement, a gesture that said, "I am here. I am watching over you." When my feet were back on the solid concrete, he stepped back, putting a careful distance between us. But his eyes held a question. He was watching my reaction, assessing my comfort. I could feel the heat still lingering on my back, a phantom touch that stayed with me for the rest of the day. I tried to read the expression in his gaze. Was it concern? Or something deeper? I saw the restraint in the way he held his hands at his sides, the slight tension in his jaw. He was being careful, so incredibly careful. And that caution, more than anything, felt like a confession. Another time, we were working side by side at the large table, sorting through a collection of daguerreotypes. The small, silvered images were haunting, their subjects staring out at us from across a century and a half. I picked one up, a portrait of a young man with dark, serious eyes not unlike my own. "He looks lonely," I murmured, more to myself than to Alistair. "Or perhaps just thoughtful," Alistair replied, his voice soft. He leaned closer to look, our shoulders brushing. The contact was slight, a simple consequence of our proximity, but neither of us moved away. We stayed there for a long moment, shoulders touching, the shared warmth a quiet current between us, both of us looking at the ghost of a boy from another time. The air grew thick with all the things we weren't saying. I could feel the soft texture of his cashmere sweater against the thin cotton of my shirt. I was intensely aware of his breathing, the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. In that moment, the space between us was not empty. It was filled with a quiet, powerful gravity, a pull that was both terrifying and exhilarating. I wanted to turn my head, to close the small distance between us, to see if the kindness in his voice was reflected in his eyes. But I was afraid. Afraid of misreading the signs, of shattering the fragile peace of our shared world. So I stayed still, my heart hammering against my ribs, and simply breathed with him in the dusty silence. He was the one who finally broke the spell. He straightened up, the contact broken, and cleared his throat softly. "We should label these before we stop for the day," he said, his voice perfectly even. But I saw the way his hand trembled slightly as he reached for a pen. And I knew that he had felt it too. The tension, the yearning, the delicate, unspoken thing that was growing between us in the quiet heart of the museum. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a dramatic event, but a slow, quiet unfolding. It began with a delivery. A new set of archival-grade shelving units had arrived, flat-packed in enormous cardboard boxes. The museum's maintenance crew was stretched thin, so Alistair announced that we would assemble them ourselves. "It will be faster," he said, with a look that dared me to disagree. So for 2 days, we traded our delicate archival work for the clumsy mechanics of Allen keys and instruction manuals. The task required cooperation, a physical partnership that was new to us. I would hold a shelf steady while he tightened the bolts, his body close to mine, his arm brushing against my back. He would brace a frame, while I climbed a small stepladder to secure the top. We fell into a nonverbal communication, anticipating each other's needs, a quiet dance of shared effort. In the middle of the second afternoon, sweating and streaked with dust, we finally finished the last unit. Alistair stepped back to survey our work, a rare, genuine smile on his face. "Not bad for a couple of historians," he said. He looked at me, his gray eyes bright with a warmth I had never seen before. I ordered us some lunch. "I hope you're hungry," he had ordered from a small, local sandwich shop I loved, but could rarely afford. We cleared a space on the large work table and ate in the middle of the archives, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the gleaming, modern evidence of our own labor. The formality between us dissolved completely. We were just two men, sharing a meal after a hard day's work. He asked me about my studies, about the professors I had admired. He listened, truly listened, his gaze focused and attentive. Then he began to talk about his own life, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as a young man who had once felt lost. He spoke of his father, a demanding and emotionally distant man who had expected him to go into finance. "I spent years trying to be someone I wasn't," he said, his voice quiet, reflective. He was looking at his hands, which were resting on the table. "This place, these objects, they were my escape. My father saw it as a pointless hobby. He never understood that this was where I felt most myself. It was the first time he had ever shown me a real vulnerability, a glimpse beneath the calm, controlled exterior. He was not just a steady pillar of the community. He was a man who had fought his own battles, who understood what it felt like to be on the outside of your own life." He looked up then, and his eyes met mine across the table. "I worry sometimes," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "I worry that my position, my wealth, makes things complicated, that it puts pressure on people." He paused, and the air between us became still and heavy with meaning. "I want you to know, Leo, that your comfort is the most important thing to me. This is a job. You are free to walk away at any time, with no hard feelings. I need you to believe that it was an open door." He wasn't just talking about the job anymore. He was talking about us, about the fragile, undefined thing that was taking shape between us. He was acknowledging the power imbalance, and in doing so, he was handing the power to me. He was telling me that he would not push, that he would not presume. He was asking for my consent, not just for my labor, but for my presence in his life. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. I thought of all the times he had been careful, all the moments of restraint, all the quiet acts of protection. He wasn't trying to control me. He was trying to create a space where I could feel safe. Safe enough to choose. I took a breath, the dusty air filling my lungs. "I'm not uncomfortable, Alistair," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I've never felt safer. A slow, profound relief washed over his features, softening the lines around his eyes. He didn't say anything more, but he didn't need to. We finished our lunch in a new kind of silence, one that was no longer filled with questions, but with a quiet, shared understanding. The foundation had settled. A long-locked door in my own heart had just creaked open, and I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and wonderful, that I was the one who was going to have to walk through it. The tipping point occurred a week later, not in the quiet sanctuary of the archives, but in the bright, public space of the museum's main gallery. The director had called an all-staff meeting to discuss an upcoming exhibition. Alistair was there, of course, standing quietly at the back of the room. I was near the front with the rest of the junior staff. Mark, a smarmy assistant curator from another department who had always treated me with a kind of amused condescension, leaned over to me while the director was speaking. "Heard you're spending a lot of time in the basement with Finch," he whispered, a smirk playing on his lips. "Playing your cards right, are you? Hope he's a generous patron." The crude insinuation landed like a punch to the gut. A hot, shameful flush crawled up my neck. It was my worst fear made real, that people would see me as an opportunist, that they would cheapen the genuine connection I felt with Alistair into a sordid transaction. I had no idea how to respond. I just stared straight ahead, my jaw tight, pretending I hadn't heard him. But Alistair had heard. I don't know how, from across the crowded room, but he had. I felt a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, and I risked a glance toward the back. Alistair was no longer looking at the director. His gaze was fixed on Mark, and it was as cold and hard as granite. It was not a threatening look, not in an overt way. It was something far more unnerving, a look of pure, dismissive power. The kind of look that could end a career with a quiet phone call. Mark seemed to shrivel under the weight of that gaze. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a pasty unease. He shifted his weight and suddenly found something fascinating to study on the ceiling. Alistair held his gaze on him for a few seconds longer before his expression softened, just slightly, as his eyes found mine. He gave me a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent promise. "You are safe. I will not let them touch you." The rest of the meeting was a blur. My mind was racing. That protective gesture was so public, so undeniable. He had drawn a line in the sand, not for his own sake, but for mine. He had made our connection visible, and in doing so, had made the silence between us impossible to maintain. Later that day, back in the archives, the air was thick with a new kind of tension. We worked for an hour without speaking, the silence stretching taut between us. Every rustle of paper, every footstep on the concrete, seemed amplified. I knew we had to talk about it, but the words were stuck in my throat. Finally, Alistair set down the ledger he was examining and turned to face me. He leaned back against the edge of the table, his arms crossed over his chest. His expression was serious, his gray eyes searching mine. "Leo," he began, his voice low and even. "What Mark said this morning was unacceptable. I have already spoken to the director. It will not happen again, thank you." I managed my voice tight. "That is not why I bring it up," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "I bring it up because it highlights a problem. A problem I have been trying very hard to navigate carefully." He paused, choosing his words. "Our association, it puts you in a vulnerable position. People will talk. They will make assumptions. This is it. I am no longer simply an employee. I am a complication in his well-ordered life." My heart sank. He was going to end it, put a professional distance between us to protect his reputation and mine. "I understand," I said, my gaze dropping to the floor. "I can go back to my old duties. We can stop the project. Is that what you want?" he asked, and the question was so direct, so stripped of all pretense, that it forced me to look up. His eyes were not cold or distant. They were filled with a profound, aching vulnerability that mirrored my own. He was not pushing me away. He was asking me to choose. He was laying his own heart bare, waiting for my answer. The subtext was gone. There was only the raw, terrifying truth hanging in the air between us. "No," I said, the word a quiet rush of air. "No, that's not what I want." He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a very long time. "Good," he said softly. "Because it is the last thing on earth that I want." He took a step toward me, then another, until he was standing before me, just as he had on that first day. But this time, there was no pretense of brushing away dust. This time, the space between us was humming with a clear and undeniable truth. He was giving me every opportunity to step back, to create distance, to say no. His hands remained at his sides, his posture open and non-threatening. He was waiting. "I want to be sure you feel you have a choice in all of this, Leo," he said, his voice a low murmur. In everything, my fear, which had been a constant companion for so long, finally gave way to a surge of certainty. This man, this kind, steady, protective man, was not a threat. He was a haven. The only risk was in not reaching for him. I took a breath, and then I spoke the plainest, most honest truth I owned. "I think," I started, my voice trembling slightly, "I feel more than just grateful to you, Alistair." The confession hung in the dusty air, small and fragile and real. For a moment, he didn't move. He just watched me, his expression unreadable. A wave of panic washed over me. Had I misread everything? Had I just destroyed the most important connection in my life? Then, the carefully constructed calm of his features seemed to break, replaced by a wave of profound, undisguised emotion. A tenderness so deep it made my own eyes burn. "Leo," he breathed, my name a sound of pure relief. "I have wanted to say something for a long time, but it couldn't come from me. It had to be your choice. It always had to be your choice." He lifted his hand, slowly, giving me time to retreat. He didn't touch my cheek or my hair. He brought his fingers to my wrist, his thumb gently stroking the sensitive skin over my pulse. My heart was hammering, a frantic bird against his steady touch. His gaze dropped to my mouth, then lifted back to my eyes, asking a silent, crucial question. I gave him the only answer I could. I leaned forward, closing the last few inches between us. The first touch of his lips was tentative, soft, a question. It was not a kiss of possession or demand, but one of pure, reverent discovery. It tasted of relief and a longing that had been held in check for what felt like an eternity. I responded in kind, a gentle pressure, a yielding. "This is right." The thought was a quiet, steady bell tolling in my mind. "This is unforced. This is real." He made a soft sound in the back of his throat, a murmur of assent, and deepened the kiss. One of his hands came up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling gently in my hair, holding me, grounding me. The other hand remained on my wrist, his thumb a steady, rhythmic anchor. It was a kiss that spoke of patience, of waiting, of a depth of feeling that left me breathless. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. When we finally broke apart, we didn't move away. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. I could feel his breath on my lips, warm and steady. My own breathing was ragged, my entire body humming with a vibrant, unfamiliar energy. He laced the fingers of his free hand with mine, our palms pressing together, a perfect fit. We stood like that for a long time in the heart of the archives, surrounded by the silent witnesses of history. Two solitary people who had finally, against all odds, found their way home to each other. The silence that returned was different now. It was not empty. It was full of a quiet, unshakable beginning. The next morning, I woke up in my own small apartment to the familiar gray light of the city filtering through my thin curtains. For a moment, everything felt dreamlike, a soft-edged memory from another life. Then the reality of the previous afternoon came rushing back in, sharp and vivid. The feel of Alistair's lips, the steady warmth of his hand in mine, the profound relief in his eyes. A smile touched my lips. But as I lay there, the quiet anxieties of my old life began to creep in, like weeds pushing through cracks in a new foundation. The reality of who we were crashed down on me. He was Alistair Finch, a man of immense wealth and influence, a pillar of the community. I was me, a curatorial assistant who could barely make rent, 25 years his junior. The words of my colleague, Mark, echoed in my ears. A generous patron. A cold knot of unease tightened in my stomach. What if that's all anyone ever saw? What if that's all he would eventually see? I imagined walking into a museum gala on his arm, the whispers, the speculative glances. I saw myself in his beautiful, expansive home, feeling like an imposter, a charity case. The kiss had felt so right, so equal, but could a relationship between us ever truly be that? The disparity was too vast, a chasm that our shared feelings might not be strong enough to cross. When I arrived at the archives that morning, Alistair was already there, cataloging a box of photographs. He looked up as I entered, and his face broke into a warm, unguarded smile that made my heart ache. "Good morning, Leo," he said, his voice soft. I tried to smile back, but I knew it didn't reach my eyes. "Morning," I mumbled, busying myself with taking off my jacket, avoiding his gaze. I could feel his smile falter, could feel his perceptive eyes studying me. The easy silence of the day before was gone, replaced by my own manufactured tension. I felt him misinterpreting my withdrawal as regret, and the thought was a fresh wave of panic. He let the silence sit for a few minutes, giving me space. Then, he put down the photograph he was holding and walked over to where I was standing. He didn't touch me. He just stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his expression one of gentle concern. "Leo," he said quietly, "talk to me. What are you thinking?" I finally met his eyes. "I'm thinking this is complicated," I admitted, my voice low. "I'm thinking about who you are and who I am. About the way it must look." He nodded slowly, his expression full of understanding, not dismissal. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about that too." For months, he took a careful step closer. "What happened yesterday, it was real for me. And it was wanted. I need to know if that's true for you as well." "Yes," I said immediately, the answer coming from the deepest part of me. "Of course, it was." "Then that is our foundation," he said, his voice firm but kind. "That is the only thing that truly matters. Everything else, the optics, the money, the assumptions, that is just noise. We can navigate the noise together, but only if we both want to. And we will do it at your pace, on your terms." He reached out then and gently touched my arm, a simple, reassuring gesture. "To start," he said, "I spoke to the director this morning. I told her that due to the personal nature of my family's collection, I would be finishing the archival project on my own. Your contract will be paid out in full, and your old position is waiting for you upstairs, starting tomorrow." I stared at him, my mind reeling. "You're firing me?" A soft, sad smile touched his lips. "No, Leo. I am removing myself as your employer. I am taking money off the table so that it can never be a question between us. So that when you are with me, it is a choice, and only a choice. No obligations. No dependencies." The careful, deliberate thought behind the gesture stunned me. He wasn't pushing me away. He was clearing a path for us. He was dismantling the power structure that had worried me, piece by piece, to prove that what he wanted was me, not an employee he was fond of. The relief was so profound it almost buckled my knees. He saw it. He understood it all. "Okay," I breathed. "Okay." Our first public test came a few weeks later. The museum was hosting the opening of the new exhibition, the same one from the staff meeting. It was the biggest event of the season. The night before, Alistair had called me. "I would like it very much if you would come with me tomorrow," he said, his voice hesitant. "Not as my guest in the way people might assume, but as my partner. If you're ready for that." My heart hammered in my chest. "I am," I said, a new and surprising confidence in my own voice. Walking into the crowded gallery by his side felt both terrifying and liberating. He didn't hold my hand or put his arm around me. We simply walked side by side, a comfortable distance between us, a quiet, united front. But I could feel the invisible tether that connected us, the shared glances, the small smiles that were meant only for each other. The whispers started, of course. I could feel the curious stares, but they didn't sting the way I had feared they would. With Alistair beside me, steady and calm, they felt like nothing more than background noise. We inevitably ran into Mark, the assistant curator. He was standing with a small group, a glass of champagne in his hand. His eyes widened slightly when he saw us approaching together. He looked from Alistair to me, a flicker of his old smirk returning. Before he could say a word, Alistair steered us toward the group and smiled, a polite, cool expression. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying easily. He nodded to the others, then his eyes landed on Mark. He didn't introduce me. Instead, he turned to me and said, his voice full of genuine warmth, "Leo, I was hoping you could give me your opinion on the lighting for the central sculpture. Your eye is always better than mine for these things." In that one simple, public statement, he had done so much. He had validated my professional opinion, positioned me as an expert, a peer. He had defined our relationship not by his wealth, but by a shared passion and mutual respect. He had completely disarmed the situation, leaving Mark speechless. I looked at the sculpture, then back at Alistair, and let a real smile spread across my face. "I think it needs a warmer gel," I said. "It would bring out the undertones in the bronze." "I agree," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He gave my arm a brief, warm squeeze, a public touch that felt both possessive and deeply respectful. "Let's find the director." As we walked away, leaving a stunned silence in our wake, I knew we would be all right. The noise was just noise. Our foundation was solid. The following weekend, Alistair invited me to his home for dinner. It was a large, beautiful house in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, but inside, it was not a sterile mansion. It was warm and lived in, filled with books and art that he had clearly collected with love, not for status. It felt like him. After a simple meal that we cooked together in his spacious, comfortable kitchen, we sat in his study, a room lined floor to ceiling with books. He handed me a small, velvet-covered box. I opened it. Inside was a single, old-fashioned brass key. "I am not asking you to move in," he said, his voice very soft, very careful. "I am not asking for anything you are not ready to give. This is just an invitation, a key to a place where you are always welcome, where you can come and go as you please, a place where you can be safe. No strings attached." I looked from the key to his face. His expression was open, hopeful, but also prepared for me to say no. He was still giving me the choice, always the choice. This was how he loved, not by possessing, but by creating sanctuary. I closed my fingers around the cool metal of the key. It felt solid and real in my palm. "I have a condition," I said, a teasing note in my voice. His eyebrows rose in surprise. "Oh, you have to make me a copy of your key too," I said, "to my tiny, run-down apartment. So you have a safe place to go." As well, the look of profound, heart-stopping love that filled his eyes in that moment is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. He didn't say anything. He just reached across the space between us, took my hand, the one holding the key, and brought it to his lips. The next morning, I woke up not in my own bed, but in his. The sun was streaming through the large windows, bathing the room in a soft, golden light. Alistair was still asleep beside me, his breathing deep and even. I lay there for a long time, just watching him, a quiet sense of wonder filling me. Later, we stood in his kitchen, making coffee together. The room was filled with the rich, comforting aroma. He was leaning against the counter, watching me as I poured hot water over the grounds. The morning light caught the silver in his hair. The space, which I had once imagined would feel intimidating and foreign, felt like the most natural place in the world. It felt like home. He handed me a mug, his fingers brushing against mine. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, The same question he'd asked in the archives when he'd sensed my fear. I smiled, a real, easy smile. I was just thinking about how worried I was, I said. About the age difference. About the money. About what people would think, and now, he prompted gently. I looked around the warm, sunlit kitchen, at this kind, steady man who had so patiently and carefully shown me his heart. I thought about the key in my wallet and the one I would have cut for him later that day. I thought about the quiet, solid weight of his hand in mine. Now, I said, meeting his gaze, I think those things are just context. They're part of our story. But they aren't the story itself. The story was about two lonely people who found each other in a dusty, forgotten room. The story was about respect. The story was about a quiet, steady love that had been built on a foundation of choice and care. He smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that reached all the way to his soul. He closed the small distance between us and kissed me, a soft, lingering kiss that tasted of coffee and a new, hopeful beginning. I was no longer afraid. I was no longer isolated. I was standing in the morning sun, with a man I loved, finally, truly, at home. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories, told with warmth and care.